welcome to Pluribus Unum's Fireside Chats. Not as good as FDR's, but hey, it's something. This episode may sound different, but it will be good different because now I'm finally recording on a desk. So now I have a consistent way that my mouth goes to my microphone. So I won't have to sometimes lounge up really close or really far, depending on where I am, but now things are good. And I'm even noticing that I'm doing like the little hand movements, where Kyle puts his hands on his desk like, yo bro, we need to do a thing. Stuff like that. Making things a lot more informal between this whole thing. Also, as of the time of the recording this, I'm like at 494 subs. So, somebody get on track to make that into 500. With that out of the way, let's get right into the news. The first bit of news is something coming after a long-standing story that everybody knew, but for some reason is only getting talked about now. New public report to blame Saudi Crown Prince for 2018 killing of Jamal Khashoggi. The Biden administration will release an intelligence report as early as Thursday that concludes that the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman approved the 2018 killing of journalist Jamal Khashoggi, 3 U.S. officials familiar with the matter said. The intelligence assessment, based largely on work by the CIA, is not new. NBC confirmed that among the organizations that it confirmed it in 2018. But the public release will mark a significant new chapter in the U.S.-Saudi relationship and clear break by President Joe Biden with former President Donald Trump's policy of equivocating about the Saudi state's role in a brutal murder that was widely condemned by the members of Congress, journalists, and a UN investigator. And by the time this episode goes up, Biden will make an official announcement about Saudi Arabia on that day. And many people are using this as a time to pressure the Biden administration to do something. Either put up sanctions against the Saudi Arabian place, or full-on disassociate with the Saudi Arabians. Now, logistically, they're not going to fully disassociate with the Saudi Arabians. There's too much money in it. So, what will they do? I honestly don't know. Maybe at most he tries to call for the Congress to officially condemn Saudi Arabia, but even then, maybe that might be a bit too much because the Saudi Arabian government will either deny it. For the most part, they probably will deny it. It's just plainly obvious that they'll try to deny it. These are unlike the Saudi Arabians I grew up around. I grew up with Saudi Arabians that took credit for their terrorist actions. Mohammed bin Salman is a disgrace to those kinds of Saudi Arabians. In my facetious rant, obviously, it's just the thing that's going to happen. Saudi Arabia thinks they can get away with literally anything because of their relationship with the United States of America. And that's just how it... And to be fair, that's true. Most countries who do bad things get away with it because of their relationship with the United States of America. Or if not them, they'll team up with one of the world's other largest superpowers. Because, think about it, when you're best friends with one of the biggest, most powerful military forces in the world, who's gonna fuck with you? Who is? It's like you being friends with the big kid in your school. Who's gonna screw with you? No one. It's how Israel managed to get away with all of their literal genocide that they're doing to the Palestinians. It's how the Saudi Arabians got away with their Yemeni genocide. Well, I think Biden is doing a thing to, condemn them now. Basically saying, hey, yo, bro, that is fucked up. But then he's, doing this thing where he's, wiggling around, you're doing a bad thing, but we're not necessarily going to do anything to try and stop you, and blah, blah, blah. Honestly, I don't know what's going to happen. Let's see what happens. Will the U.S. officially cut ties with Saudi Arabia? Very unlikely, but it's potential. If Biden actually does do that, then that'd be kind of cool, honestly. That would immediately make all those people who go well, Biden has already been worse than Donald Trump. It's I don't like that. You're judging a person who just got in office versus a person who's had 4 years done. Unless Biden's first act was literally go into a literal full-on military invasion of another country, then, honestly, no, he wasn't. He's on the same level right now because they haven't done anything yet. We have to wait at least until 2021 or 2022 before we can officially start making assessments on the Biden administration. And even then, I even go so far as to say that we can't make full assessments until he retires. If he stays in office until 2028, very unlikely, but if he does attempt to do that, or at least actually if he manages to do it, then we can make a judgment on Joe Biden. You have to wait. You can only judge a president fully at the end of his term. You can make assessments of what they do, but you can't make full-on judgments like, oh, he's worse than Trump, or he's worse than Biden, or not Biden, like Obama, or something like that. You can't do that until the term is completely over. So that way you have all the information, or at least for the most part, the most information of the general time period. Then maybe in a couple of years, you might want to take a look again. Like, for example, maybe we can look at Trump administration in 2022, like look back at it and see like what were the long-lasting effects of his administration. But anyways, that's a side rant. We're getting off topic. Back to the news. Turns out something interesting is happening during the Amazon unionization. Like, for those who don't know, Amazon, like people in Alabama, are trying to unionize Amazon, or at the very least, they are starting a union. Well, turns out Amazon has decided to hire Pinkerton agents to surveil workers who are trying to form unions. Now, while this source technically talks about like a, foreign Amazon warehouse in Poland, they say like, come on, Amazon's a big company. You really think that they're going to like just stop at like, oh, we're only going to do it in Poland? No. They're going to do it everywhere. This is almost every place that starts a union. They're always going to find a mole, a rat, a scab. Scab is a different thing. Scab is when they hire workers to not do union job work. But basically, they're going to do it. That's what happens in every single time someone starts a union. People forget, like, how much people hate unions. And, like, this notion that all these big tech billionaires are progressives and, like, liberals and trying to fight the good fight for, like, the evil leftist cultural Marxist propaganda is just flat out nonsense. Due to the fact that these guys, they were just openly, like, these guys are very openly anti-union. That would, if they were Marxists, they would not be anti-union. That's just obvious. People forget, like, people think that this kind of, like, big bad union stuff, like, all this happened in the past, but no, this still goes on to this day. They still hire investigators to, like, track down union members. I guarantee you that some of these, that they're going to start putting Facebook ads saying, like, these guys are, like, seditious people. Like, I guarantee you there's, like, somebody who's planning to, like, take down famous union leaders and, like, accuse them of being communists in order to try and delegitimize them. And, like, these guys, like, have blatant anti-union propaganda inside of their places. Like, there was this one company that literally said, like, I forget which company it was, but, like, they had a sign in their, like, bathroom, and it said, like, don't pay your union dues, $200 can buy you lots of video games. It's like, really? Really, that is your big plan to try and stop union organizing? This is almost as if, like, when Mexico tried to, like, ban leftist organization by banning rock and roll music. It's just, what? That's a stupid idea. It's just so weird. Like, people, you gotta remember, this stuff still happens. This isn't something that went away when the time periods changed. That still happens. But anyways, now on to the next story. Utah. Utah House passes a bill to advance ranked choice voting. On February 12th, the Utah House of Representatives passed HB 75, which makes it easier for cities to use ranked choice voting for their town officers if they want to. The bill provides what a city decides to use ranked choice voting. The county elections officials and the city's county must help it. Many cities do not administer their own elections. They depend on the county elections office to do that. So basically, this is the first step for Utah getting ranked choice voting. Because that's how it works. You gotta start small. Everybody forgets this. Everybody wants to do this big, massive thing, but they do sometimes forget. Sometimes you just have to go small. You don't run for president in a day. Like, state representatives do not run for president. They have to go, like, up a rank. They have to start small in order to go big. Now, the thing is, it's funny, like, this hit in my head when I was, like, thinking about ranked choice voting. Like, a lot of third-party advocates do talk about ranked choice voting all the time. Usually the progressive ones. Not really so much the conservative ones. But there's a reason for that. This is something people don't realize. If you make ranked choice voting, there is a potential, like third-party activists, them supporting ranked choice voting is effectively suicide. Because if you make ranked choice voting, the idea is that third parties would be the first choice and never be the choice that makes it to the end of the final round. That's it. That's what it does. Like, if third-party advocates were more serious on, like, actually building up third parties and stuff, they would push for something like proportional representation. But, like, they push for ranked choice voting because they want to fix the electoral system, not just build their own profiles. I mean, sure, technically, if you open the door for, like, the Green to take a seat in the U.S. House, they might be like, every Democrat might be like, well, I mean, I guess if I'll vote for the Green for the first choice, and then vote, like, my second choice be, like, the Democrat just to make sure and blah, blah, blah. But then everybody has that same idea, and then they all go ahead and vote Green, and then that Green goes into the U.S. House. That is a potential, but, well, it's a lot more likely that more people who are going to vote Democrat for their first choice and then vote, like, the Green as a second choice. Like, for example, there's this guy in New York who's, like, New York City, which has a ranked choice voting system now, is going to be using it for their mayoral election. He's voting for Scott Stringer for his first choice, and then Dianne Morales as a second choice, despite the fact that Morales is a smaller candidate and would probably benefit more if she were the first choice option and not the second choice. But he's choosing the candidates that he wants to make it to the first round without actually needing to go to any more rounds. And it's like one of the many electoral systems that are weird. Like, for example, the California and Louisiana jungle primaries. Third parties really hated those. Like the top two it's not even a jungle. Well, I mean, it is kind of a jungle primary. I mean, it's weird because, like, Washington and Louisiana all technically have, like, jungle primary states. Basically, the idea is, like, every candidate runs. Like, Green, Democrat, Independent, Red, like, Green, not Green, why did I say Green twice? Republican, there's a Freudian slip. I'm trying to say that all Republicans are Greens, ooh. But basically, all the candidates of all the parties run. They all run in the same election. Now, in California and Washington, these two states, no matter the vote percentages of the top two vote getters, they will move on to a second round. Meanwhile, Louisiana works a little differently. They will only move on to a second round if the number one choice has less than 50%. Now, this has effectively killed third parties in both of their states, really. Because barring any, like, big name third party candidate, they haven't really gone so far. Like, the last election cycle, 2020, I'll go back a little bit more, 2018. 2018, there were 3 Greens that made it to the general election. Laura Wells, Kenneth Mejia, and Rodolfo Cortez Barragan. Meanwhile, in 2020, none of them made it. Well, I mean, technically, to be fair, Rodolfo was the only one who ran, and there was, like, a Peace and Freedom Party candidate and some American Independent Party people, but, like, they didn't make it to the general election because they don't have any support, really. They have some support, but they don't have that much. Not to sound cliche and, do the thing that everybody says, like, I want there to be a multi-party system. I do not just want third party, I want a fourth or fifth party in the race as well. Or if I want to sound third party cliche, I want there to be a second party. Am I right? Everybody who says that, but, like, honestly, how many of you are actually willing to follow through with that? Like, I mean, Mike Figurino from the Humans Report, I'll call him out. I'll say this. He's like, I want there to be a multi-party system. He didn't vote for Howie in Oregon. Cal Kalinske, he didn't vote at all in 2020. Me? I voted Howie Hawkins in a swing state. So yeah, now let's move on to the next story. Speaking of swing state Green Party, the Constitution and Green parties are getting a little bit more time in North Carolina to get their voters back. Basically, long story short, Green and Constitution parties, they didn't do so hot in the 2020 elections. So basically, the rules were that these two were going to get kicked off the ballot, and then all of the people who were registered to vote with them would be re-registered as independents. And that these guys would be forced to pretty much go back to being like a petition one, like being a petition candidate. Basically, the rule is, if your party does not do hot in the elections, you will basically be kicked off of the ballot, and then you'll have to re-register, go through the whole process again. The Libertarian Party, the Democrat and Republican parties, they obviously do fine with the vote totals, but these two, they don't do so hot. But the North Carolina Board of Elections is giving them until June 12th to officially certify it. They're basically saying, look, all you need to do is, get signatures. Like, get 13,900 signatures, and fine, you will stay. And, I haven't gotten any of the petitions from these two guys. I would sign the Green Party petition. Look, Constitution Party, I'm not signing your petition, bro. Get out of here with that. Get out of here with that BS. I don't even know how, never mind. I was going to say, I would be open to signing the Libertarian Party's petition, but again, they don't need it. They do fine on their own. They have a consistent voting base. The Green Party's voting base really only exists when the Democrats get mad and literally go, oh, I want to vote for Bernie. Well, you can vote for another old man instead. Anyways, now let's move on to some outside of the U.S. news, because remember, other countries outside of the U.S. exist. First, let's continue up with some Myanmar stuff. The Myanmar ambassador to the UN tried to get the UN to reverse the military coup that happened. He even held up a protest sign that they did, like the three-fingered salute, which is what many of the anti-coup protesters in Myanmar salute with. The Myanmar government decided that it was time for him to leave his post, and he is now fired. And state television has said that he, quote, betrayed the country and spoken for an unofficial organization who doesn't represent the country and had abused the power and responsibilities of an ambassador. Yeah, Kiyamotun, if that's how you pronounce your name, you need to leave Myanmar, now? Because I guarantee you, if he doesn't, we're going to be seeing a news story of former Myanmar ambassador killed. I stand with him. Support your country against a coup that happened. That's good. When coups happen, they should be called out. A revolution is different than a coup. A coup is when people take over power for being bad. Well, basically, that's just... The definition of a coup and a revolution are always different. The idea that I have for, revolution versus coup is that a revolution comes from the people. Coup comes from, top elites. For example, the Mexican Revolution. The Mexican Revolution would have probably been considered a coup if Madero did the thing that he said he was going to do. He went to the U.S. to try and get their help to, dispose of Porfirio Diaz. But it became a revolution when people like Emiliano Zapata stepped in and basically took the people to lead the charge. That's what separates it from what's happening in Venezuela. If Juan Guaido was able to, at the very least, get the people to push for him instead of going to the U.S., then it would have gotten, a whole lot more credibility. And I think a lot more people would probably be sympathetic to Juan Guaido. Speaking of Juan Guaido, I actually said both Mexico and Venezuela, which both ties in the next stories. But we're going to start with the Venezuela one first, because this is interesting. Venezuela, Guaido barred from holding public posts for 15 years. Venezuela's comptroller, General Elvis Amoroso, on Tuesday, disqualified the former lawmaker Juan Guaido from holding public office for 15 years due to his failure to comply with his legal obligations. Amoroso stated that the decision is based on Guaido's refusal to submit an asset-sworn declaration after ending his functions as congressman. We know that the people are involved with corruption acts and have stolen money of all Venezuelans. They must have something to hide, he said. Yeah, I'll be honest, this does not sound like a authoritarian regime to me. I'm not saying that Venezuela can't be criticized. They 100% can be. There are some people who make videos openly criticizing the Venezuelan government. And there's some things to a degree, there are some problems with the Venezuelan government. I've always maintained that, yes, technically sanctions did help, but we do have to acknowledge that to a degree, Maduro's policies did probably have some impact in regards to how the people are living. There's a video by a guy called Bad Empanada, who he openly states, even though everybody's look, we are in the place with the food. They have food, and it's cost $15. Wow. Except the minimum wage in Venezuela is like $1, so they can't really afford it. They basically did the reverse of poverty porn. For those who don't know what it is, like, you know how when you go on like TV, you'll like see these commercials, or at least you saw these commercials like in the early 2000s of like, these are starving children in Africa. Please give $1 a day to help feed these African children who do not have any food. They basically shoot the poorest parts of a nation and then make it seem like that's the entire nation. Max Blumenthal in the Gray Zone, they kind of did the opposite. They did the opposite. They went to the best places in Venezuela, and they made that seem like it was the whole country, when in fact that is just something you can't do. Like, for example, you can go to like the most richest parts of California and New York and pretend that that's the entire United States, but that's not true. Or you can go to Alabama and pretend that that's the whole United States. That's not true either. I live in North Carolina. I've been to prosperous cities that are like great in play, but I've also been to places where people live in houses that are filled with mold. There is almost no society where the entire nation lives in like comforting paradise. And this includes like every nation: United States, Soviet Union, Venezuela, Mexico, Britain, Bolivia. Even in like the poor area, like even like Scandinavian countries, it's obvious that there's at least some parts of them that are probably very not wealthy and probably aren't doing so hot. But you can't pretend that that's the entire nation. Some parts of the nation do good, some parts of the nation do terribly. Go to Mexico, again, I'll use that as an example, as a segue. You will see like the northern parts of the country incredibly rich. They've always been incredibly rich, because they have a proximity to the United States border and they get all the goods from the United States. That money goes through and through. But go to the southern parts of Mexico, they live in clay houses that are filled with nothing. It's a mixed bag every part of the place. Anyways, the last story comes from Mexico. And this is a blind spot, 100%, I'll give it that. Okay, so Mexico's ruling party is divided over a particular candidate. There's a candidate by the name of Felix Salgado Macedonio. He is a gubernatorial candidate in Mexico's state of Guerrero. And while he was running, there were accusations that this guy was accused, like he was accused basically of rape. Not even basically, like women flat out accused him of raping them or sexual assault. But like most cases, turns out they reported it a little too late, and thus not a lot of people could do anything about it, to a degree. Like, you know, the statute of limitations was gone. Like, they reported it like 22 years after it happened, so they're like, well, I mean, there's nothing we can do now, really. And this was around the time that Morena was choosing someone to be their candidate, and it just so happens that this individual happened to win. And that led to a huge controversy, because AMLO has already been accused of being too soft on like women's rights and stuff. That's been a common thing. Like, femicides went up during AMLO's administration. What's AMLO doing to actually tackle this problem? Despite the fact that I remember reading a source that said that technically AMLO couldn't really do anything about it in that particular instance. But this instance was different. This was a candidate that Morena had chosen to be their candidate for governor. So they had many options they could do. They could choose to either keep him going, or they could choose to remove him and replace him with someone else. And that's where the controversy began, because whenever AMLO was pressed on this, he would dismiss the claims and say like, yo, no, this is just people accusing him, like trying to ruin his reputation. This is a fine man, good person, 100%, and I support him 100%. And it's like, AMLO, bro. I mean, like, let's be fair. I don't know if the people accusing him are like accusing him of like real things, because we don't have the evidence. I've always been of the person that's like, yeah, do we have the evidence of the claims though? But it's like, you don't dismiss them out of the gate. You at the very least have to conduct an investigation. And that's where a lot of controversy began, because AMLO was like 100% like, I stand by Felix, I think his name is. I forget his name already, but I don't care. And this is where something interesting happened. Like, I didn't know this until, like, now, but, like, just yesterday, or even just today, they had officially decided to remove him from the contention to be their candidate. And if stated point blank, like, we're going to be doing a new process to try and fix it. Particularly Mario Delgado, the person who is now the head of Morena, is the one leading this charge. While female members, of course, were leading the charge to try and get them to reconsider in the first place, Mario Delgado was like saying, like, look, guys, the judicial process is crap, really. These are long-standing laws, and it stinks. But we as Morena, we want to make sure that our party is a safe space for women. So we will, of course, replace him. Well, I mean, replace him is a strong word. They're redoing the election process, but it's remained unclear if this guy can seek the office again. I assume not. I assume that even if he technically can, Morena's going to pressure him to basically say, like, no, go away. No. So yeah, originally this episode, this story was going to be me, like, criticizing AMLO and being like, you know, like, this is a bad idea. You should probably reconsider. But it turns out they actually did reconsider and actually are replacing him. But again, I mean, to be fair, this is Mario Delgado's decision, not AMLO's decision. AMLO was still kind of cringe because he went all like, hey, blah, blah, blah. We need to defend this man. He's a good man. It's like, not Mario. AMLO, you at the very least, you need to vet these claims before you make any accusations. Like, I mean, and to be fair, these could be fake. But at the very least, we need to look into them. These need to be taken seriously. That has always been my belief. Take them seriously. You don't have to believe at first, but you at the very least need to show legitimacy and show, like, we are listening. Let's talk. Hear this out. Tell your story. That's why the Me Too movement was so good. I mean, it wasn't good because all these women and men were raped and, like, sexually assaulted, but it was good in the sense that people were finally talking about this. They were finally opening up with their stories, and that in turn would make people more open to sharing the accusations of, like, when they happen. Because think about it, like, all these Me Too accusations, did anybody think any of the people were going to go to jail? No. But that wasn't the point. The point was to hold them accountable just so we could show that we are taking this very seriously. This is a very serious thing that is happening, and we need to change the society to fix it. And now maybe the next generation of people won't have to, like, wait until they're 85 before they can reveal their story. They can reveal it when it happens so that we can actually charge these guys and throw them in prison. Wouldn't that be a good world? Where people who are accused of sexual assault would go to jail? I vote that would be an amazing world. Instead of having them live without it ever even touching them for like 10 years and then have their already dying career die faster. Let their career die when it's vital. Anyways, now that we have all that out of the way, let's move on to the main topic of this video. My thoughts on Glenn Greenwald. Oh boy. Glenn Greenwald. This guy. Now, I guess I should explain who Glenn Greenwald is, because that's the format of the Thoughts On show. For those who legitimately do not know who this person is, I will tell you who they are. Glenn Greenwald is an American journalist, author, and former attorney. He's well known for quite a number of things. First, let's talk about some of his early career and stuff. He first started blogging on national security issues on October 2005. He was becoming increasingly aware of George Bush's administrations and, their attacks on civil liberties due to 9/11. This inevitably led him, with all the thing, it was like this civil libertarian type thing. And he pretty much maintained a critical position of, the U.S. foreign policy, which eventually earned him spots in Salon and The Guardian, writing articles for them, of course. Now, the thing is, he then, he didn't really get that much well-known at the time, sort of. He sort of was well-known. He was well-known in the sense that he was, sort of that, again, civil libertarian, individual who would, write articles that many people probably wouldn't even really consider writing. Now, he talked about a lot of different incidents, including the Plame affair, where an individual by the name of Robert Novak published that Valerie Plame was a CIA officer, basically outing her to, the whole world. The subsequent CIA leak grand jury investigation. Basically, he got famous around all those areas. I was looking at the individual things, and it turns out, they're all pretty much the same thing. Because it lists, multiple things on, his Wikipedia, and it's, they're all basically the same thing. The same controversy. CIA leaks, NSA warrantless surveillance. That particular, with this particular last one, the NSA surveillance leaks, but not the ones you're thinking of. These are actually different ones from 2001 to 2007, and his subsequent, article coverings about Chelsea Manning was actually what paved him the way to one of his most famous endeavors when Edward Snowden contacted him and pretty much went to him and another member of the Guardian to basically reveal to the world that the NSA had been conducting warrantless wiretapping on pretty much the entirety of the American populace. Basically, the entire American populace was being spied on due to the fact that 9/11 happened, and it essentially served as the, person who, he didn't blow the whistle, but he, talked about it. He was the journalist that exposed the story. But basically, Greenwald, that was his niche, the surveillance state, that kind of stuff. That was his bread and butter. Eventually, Greenwald earned enough, he built up enough of a name for himself due to all that, that he was able to form a website called The Intercept, which was basically to serve as a sort of new, it was basically new journalism, new media. The prospect of new media always rises. Radio, that became a bastion of progressive talk, and the conservatives took it over, but then there's also the online spaces, the TV spaces, Democracy Now!, The Intercept. Those kinds of things, they always happen. Somebody will always try to form the new thing, and when that old thing becomes obsolete, they'll form a new one. For example, really, who watches Democracy Now! Anymore? Me? No. I only follow them on Twitter because they're the OG indie media people, and I gotta support them where they stand. But I don't watch them or listen to them on the radio. That's lame. I'm not an old man. But basically, back to Greenwald, that was his big thing. He was the person that you would talk to about, intelligence. That would be his bread and butter. He would always go against the surveillance state. He'd always go against, politicians in power. And basically, he was, sort of the name of investigative journalism for a bit. The media, when the Edward Snowden leaks happened, he was on mainstream media all day long. But as the mainstream media kind of went lackluster, he went, he distanced himself from them. Because, rightfully so, they don't cover necessarily all the things that they need to cover. Remember, the mainstream media were the same people that, spent, days and days and days talking about a crashed plane. And then they, did, breaking news. The Titanic turns 102 years old. It's what? Basically due to the fact that they have a 24-hour news cycle. And they wouldn't necessarily talk about the stories that needed to be talked about. Glenn was hey, I'll fill in the blanks. I'll tell stories that people need to tell. And Greenwald was sort of he sort of inspired certain other people to kind of do the same thing. I wouldn't say I am inspired by Glenn Greenwald, but I acknowledged his big accomplishments and all the things that he's done, and they deserve to be commended. Yeah, cool. You helped leak Edward Snowden leaks. Cool. He kind of got crapped on by certain other people. Bill Maher actually shit on him hard because while Edward Snowden was going hiding in Hong Kong and then later Russia, Glenn Greenwald was walking free, and he's shouldn't you be in jail too? What? And it's and Glenn Greenwald was well, the problem is, the problem isn't that I should be in jail. The problem is that Snowden shouldn't be in jail. And that's where the big thing was. But that's the thing. When you make your thing hating on the United States Intelligence Agency, and that's it, you kind of, sort of, don't have an identity of your own. For example, he's been described by many people as, like, he's the American left's top journalist. He was described that way by Rachel Maddow due to the fact that of, like, again, the Snowden leaks. But the thing is, he never really gave himself a political label. He didn't identify as a progressive. He didn't identify as a liberal. He didn't identify as a libertarian. He didn't have a political identification. In fact, throughout his political career, he actually tried to, like, distance himself from political labels. Like, he's like, I'm not really ideological. I'm just here for, like, this basic stuff. And the stuff that he advocated for was pretty much all the stuff that you could really label a bunch of people. Like, he rallied against the surveillance state. Okay, a lot of people rally against the surveillance state. He rallied against drug prohibition. Okay, a lot of people rally against drug prohibition. In fact, so much so, let me pull up this clip from an old YouTube video. And this kind of explains, like, how Glenn Greenwald's, like, positions were enough for everybody to be in favor of. Because this is a video entitled, Ron Paul and the 6 Kinds of Libertarianism. I'll even include a link to it in the description. Because it was a really cool video, honestly, when I was learning about all this stuff.
The libertarian is a term that was recently used to describe the fusion of liberals and libertarians in fighting against bad Bush-era policies. In truth, most libertarians wouldn't consider themselves libertarians at all, but their version of liberalism is much different than what is espoused by the Democratic establishment. While economically these liberals will not reconcile with libertarians, there are many issues that we come to agreement with, and when alliances are formed, sometimes people cross over. The first major example would be Mario Savio, who is known for his great speeches in the 60s. Today's champions include Ralph Nader, Naomi Wolf, and Glenn Greenwald.
Now, I guess I should, push back on this a bit, because Mario Savio was a socialist, but basically that's what he's saying. His idea is, like, they sort of have, like, a libertarian-ish bend on, like, a lot of social issues. Like, one way, I think one figure that he should have included in there that probably would have explained it better would be Russ Feingold or Dennis Kucinich. He just talking about Dennis Kucinich in the beginning of the video, but he sort of, like, uses it to try and differentiate Kucinich from Obama. And he's like, well, Obama's a liberal, but Kucinich is a different kind of liberal. It's like, basically that's what he described as a libertarian, sort of like a mix of a libertarian and, like, Democrat, sort of. Greenwald kind of sort of started getting involved in politics a bit more and started making some more political endorsements around that era, which did kind of show, like, yeah, I guess I do see where his bend is. Like, he endorsed Russ Feingold for re-election, he endorsed Cecil Bothwell in North Carolina District 11, and Norman Solomon in California District 2. So, like, again, it's this sort of, like, the libertarian aspects really come from the idea that, they don't espouse, like, the Democrat Party's, views on blank. Even to a degree, I consider myself, like, a civil libertarian to a degree, because, like, though, to be fair, that really is, like, pretty much just leftism, really, when you think about it. Basically, it's libertarianism in its old-fashioned, like, really, who cares if somebody wants to, like, have 3 wives? I don't care, do you? And as Glenn Greenwald, like again, this is his bread and butter, like, the surveillance state. That was the thing that gave him, like, it was the thing that gave him the most common ground in regards to, like, things. Like, for example, like, I mean, come on, libertarians loved Dennis Kucinich, and they loved Russ Feingold. And you see, this sort of led into, like, the next generation, because as things move forward, Glenn Greenwald sort of had to adapt to the changing situations. And one of the big things that happened was Russiagate. And of course, Greenwald was opposed to, like, the idea that Russia interfered with the United States election, and that was one of his big things. Push against that. When Julian Assange was jailed, he criticized that. Good on him. But Greenwald, he sort of, like, again, his brand was to build a bridge between him, like, progressives, I guess you could label them, and, like, the right wing, like, the populist right. It's like the same thing, like, build a bridge between them. And that has led him to, like, sort of build bridges with these people. Commonly, Like, one of his more recent examples is Joe Rogan. You know, Rogan was sort of more of that libertarian-ish bend. But then, like, you know, Greenwald and him frequently talk. And him and Tucker Carlson frequently talk as well. The idea is, like, again, the populist left, populist right, we work together to build common goals, common things, and blah, blah, blah. Greenwald had gotten a lot of controversy due to his association with the latter more than the former. Because, again, like, at least Joe Rogan endorsed Bernie and voted for him. But Tucker Carlson, he, like, I mean, apparently there were leaked DMs, or not DMs, like an email, and Tucker Carlson said, like, he literally votes for the candidate that's the most establishment because it'll get him the most views. Because if the establishment person's in charge, that's the thing. That's the thing everybody acknowledges. Like, they should acknowledge. It's easier to be the person who is in the opposition. It's easy for me to sit here and go, like, why doesn't the, you know, Congress do this or this or this? But it's not easy for me to offer my own solutions. Like, for example, let me use an example that isn't necessarily as, like, I mean, not notable, but, like, an example that's not as, like, politically oriented. Movies. Everybody can sit there and, like, watch a movie and then say, this movie sucks, it's bad, I hate it. But considerably less people will be able to actually make a better movie, or even at the very least offer criticisms that would levy a actual change. For example, I take that to heart whenever actually I think about it. I used to be in that same room like, oh, this movie stinks. But now when I do that, now I actually think of like, okay, how would I fix it? How would I improve it? What would be a better scene? Like, if I don't like this scene, what would I change? And that's a similar thing with a lot of people online in regards to politics. Sure, they'll criticize everything, but what do they actually do to fix it? What would be their solutions? And that's kind of a problem that many people have figured out for, like, a lot of different groups of people. Most particularly those groups of people that talk about, like, that populist left, populist right alliance. Yes, we can all agree that there are problems, but it's the solutions that are the problem. Ironically enough. Like, yes, Glenn Greenwald and Tucker Carlson can both agree that the political establishment stinks, but why do they think it stinks? And let me give you another example. During the 2008 presidential election, there were 4 major third-party candidates. Ralph Nader, Cynthia McKinney, Chuck Baldwin, and Bob Barr. They agreed on some things, no doubt. You know, they agreed that foreign intervention was a bad thing. But, like, the agreements always ended at certain points. Like, for example, they all agreed, like, oh, the political establishment stinks. But what was their reasoning for hating the political establishment? Someone like Chuck Baldwin would argue that the Republicans are too far to the left. Meanwhile, that is the complete opposite of what someone like Ralph Nader would say. He would argue that the Democrats are too far to the right. Of course, there would be some agreement on certain levels. For example, Bob Barr and Chuck Baldwin would probably agree on, like, economic issues. Cynthia McKinney and Ralph Nader would probably both agree, like, maybe we should impact and make a universal healthcare model. Cynthia McKinney and Chuck Baldwin would probably both agree that they hate the Jews, but basically, there really isn't actually overlap in certain areas. Like, you'll never get a member of the Constitution Party to agree on something like gay rights. That's just not a thing that they're going to do. And you're never going to get them on things like, you're not going to let them, they're not going to agree with you on certain things, and that's just 100% the case. But this whole idea of, like, this alliance, like, I mean, if you want to make the alliance purely on, like, the things you agree on, then that's fine. But you gotta make sure you know that. The thing about these, like, people who do, like, the left populist, right populist, they, like, make it seem like this is, like, the big end-all be-all. The second this happens, we'll have this magical kumbaya moment where all the problems in the world are fixed. No, because what happens when those right-wing populists now all of a sudden are like, okay, now let's try and get the gays banned. Whoa, hold on, no, but you said we're a part of a team. There isn't an end goal is what I'm saying. And Glenn has kind of sort of fallen into that crowd. And that crowd has kind of led him to take certain positions that might seem a bit like much. But before we get into those, we should probably talk a little bit about his stuff in Brazil, because he's been a fierce critic of, say, Jair Bolsonaro, who's been like this very fierce, like pretty much open fascist who has run Brazil, to the point where he's leaked messages that point out that the group that sent Lula to jail were in fact literally doing it specifically to prevent Lula from running for re-election against Jair Bolsonaro. And due to that, many of Bolsonaro's supporters have threatened to, kill them, take their kids, and blah, blah, blah. He's even been punched live on air by, a right-wing Brazilian, news personality, basically Brazil's Rush Limbaugh. But since we're done with Brazil, let's move on back to the United States and, just worldwide, where he starts getting into a bit of a very interesting crowd. You see, Glenn Greenwald has been, like I said, he's been cozying up to this crowd for a little bit, and this has led to him making some very interesting statements. And you see, I didn't know about this until I watched, the Joe Rogan podcast episode where he and Joe Rogan were talking, where basically he just came out and said, a certain position that he felt very strongly about.
Yeah, I'll tell you, what this experience I had recently that I found horrifying and, really illuminated for me how repressive things had become. I went to New York, as I often do because the media outlet I founded is based there, and I had dinner with two colleagues who work in journalism and who are actually pretty well established in their careers. They're not, junior level journalists who are clinging to a job. They're people who have climbed up the editorial and journalistic ladder. And one of them, they both live in Brooklyn. And one of them has a 15-year-old daughter whose best friend is a trans boy who has had top surgery. So he has had his breast removed and poses on Instagram with his shirt off. And then my other friend with whom I was dining that night, it was pretty recently, maybe within the last year, has a 17-year-old daughter who's dating a trans boy who's 17, who's also had various gender reassignment surgeries. And we were talking just, as friends about how young people these days are who are making this choice to identify as trans and to pursue gender reassignment surgery, have permanent alterations to their body that will never be reversible, even if later on in life they decide that they had misdiagnosed themselves or been misdiagnosed. And both of them were expressing serious concerns about, as parents of teenagers, about how pervasive this was becoming and whether there was kind of something in the culture encouraging or even pressuring kids to reach these conclusions and parents to kind of push them into it for their own reasons. Not anything malicious, but just kind of cultural encouragement that might be leading people to be misdiagnosed or misdiagnosing themselves. And also, secondly, the capacity of someone at the age of 14 or 15 to make decisions about their lives of that magnitude that would be irreversible, biologically or anatomically irreversible. And it was a really interesting conversation we talked about. We explored the issue. It was, a really interesting discussion. We probably talked about 45 minutes or an hour. I got back to Brazil, and I realized that discussion that we had, they would never, ever in a million years in their column, on a podcast, on their show, admit to having those thoughts. They would never be willing to explore publicly those questions that we were all raising with one another and thinking about in a really interesting way, because they're petrified of being scorned for it or being condemned. And that is a sickness in our culture.
Okay, so I decided to include that whole clip without any interruptions because I felt that would give it the best context. But basically, to summarize, Glenn Greenwald was saying, he was espousing a idea that he had that was basically that society is forcing their children to be transgender. There's something in the society, in our culture, which is pushing kids to identify as transgender, which, for those who don't know, has pretty much been a conservative talking point for a while now, ever since a lot more people have been identifying as transgender. A thing that does not exist. This is one notion that I've never understood. And it even goes so far. Like, this isn't the first time people have been, like, accusing, like, oh, the media and our culture is making kids a certain way. That's what they've been doing for a long time. For those who don't know, this is literally what they said about gay people. That the media was making your kids gay due to the shows that they were watching. Like, your kids watching Sesame Street is your society pushing the homosexual agenda onto them because of Bert and Ernie. And for those who don't know, that was an actual thing that was being espoused. They've also accused SpongeBob of being a homosexual icon, and that he was sending the secret subliminal message that kids should be gay and blah blah blah. But basically, this is not anything new to the LGBTQ community. But this very notion that this exists on a massive scale, because Glenn is implying like the culture is forcing kids to be transgender, and maybe their parents are forcing their kids to be transgender. For one, that implies that a majority of the people who are transgender, or at least a good some of them, they're not actually transgender. Basically, he's spewing the trans-trender thing, where people accuse people of, like, you know, being transgender for, like, the shtick, which just makes no sense. That just makes absolutely zero sense. Like, oh yes, I'm gonna identify as the opposite sex, because then I'll get beaten and get a hate crime committed against me. Yeah, definitely. No, that's stupid. This is the same people who are like, oh, being gay or bi or trans, this is just a phase. Why would you choose this? Do you think trans people want to be trans? No, they don't. No member of the LGBTQ community wants to be LGBTQ. Why? Because society hates them. Why would they choose to be a member of a specific group that is hated by society? If you were given a choice in the matter, wouldn't you choose to be the people who like have all of the power and all of the fame? Why would you choose to be a group where it is still legally acceptable to be kicked out of your parents' house, where it's still legally acceptable to be turned away at a job? Why would you choose that? The answer is they don't. Not even for like the meme or the joke. This notion that there's this mass influx of people who identify as transgender that are not really transgender is stupid. In fact, like a majority of people don't even think transgenderism itself exists. There are people in society right now that do not believe that trans people exist, that they are just people with mental illnesses, which then negates their argument, because if you're saying that they're people with mental illnesses, then they technically still exist to you. Like, society at the very least has grown to accept the fact that gay people exist, and not like that they are just not a thing. For trans people, there are a lot of people who just don't think it's a thing. That it doesn't exist. You really think a bunch of people are just going to say, you know what? I just want to be that. I want to get hated by all of my friends, all of my peers, get the ability to be fired or hate crimed, because why? Because society is pressuring your kids to do it? How? Where? Where in society is this massive transgender push? Where is it? I would love to see it, Glenn, or anyone else who thinks that this exists. Especially considering, I guarantee you, there are a lot more cases of people who identify as trans who are forced to just be gay. I mean, I'm not saying that there are people where this doesn't exist. There probably are some people who do say, like, why don't you just become a woman? But considering the fact that we live in a society where I don't even know the exact numbers, like, of people who accept transgenderism or stuff. But, like, a lot of people still don't believe that transgenderism is a thing. How is there this massive societal push to turn people trans? Like, where is this? This does not exist. You're making something up that doesn't exist. If you were to have the argument like, oh, but how young is too young? It's like a part of that clip is like where he says like, how young can people make these decisions? And I mean, yes, those are conversations that exist and they are happening. Scientists are talking about this. But the fact is, the scientists are basing this on the idea that this is a thing that happens because, I mean, statistically, it happens. The fact that there are, like, millions of people who are, like, born male and then identify as female, it's probably enough evidence for me to at least assume that this is something that actually happens. Like, I mean, it's not like this is, like, one person in the 30s identified as a woman and then it never happened again. This is, like, that's not even close to what happened. And back to the scientist claim, doctors and scientists, they don't go decent enough. Like, when, like, all this stuff that they're talking about, like, oh, do these big life-changing things. Like, I mean, I don't think, like, as you could tell, like, he talked about, like, 16-year-olds. Yeah, 16-year-olds is what he talked about. 16, 17, people who had top surgery. What do you think they're gonna do? Do this to, like, a 5-year-old? No, of course not. And he talks about the fact that there are kids as young as 12 who, like not in this clip, but, like, a different clip, because he's talking about this multiple times, and I'll get to one part where he talks about this at a certain degree, but he talks about, like, the fact that, oh, there are people as young as 12 who do this. Should we trust them and, like, what they identify with? I mean, like, when you're 12, what do you really believe? Do you think you're old enough? Well, but when you're 12 or 13 or, like, 10, they're not just gonna go, like, it's not like a kid, like a 5-year-old kid is gonna be like, sir, I identify as a woman. Well, time for pee-pee, bye-bye. No, that's not what's gonna happen. There is a whole process that the kids have to go through before they can even think about doing that. And I'm pretty sure, like, that decision is, like, left up to adulthood. Or, like, at least under the parents' discretion. Now, it seemed like this situation was one and done. Like, Glenn would talk about this once, never talked about it again. Some people got mad about it, some people didn't. Because not a lot of people watched the Joe Rogan podcast by the tail end of him moving to Spotify. But then Glenn Greenwald said something 3 days ago, which was very interesting, where he was talking about new findings in a Gallup poll, because a Gallup poll basically talked about the rise of LGBTQ individuals, and here's what happened. The amount of people who identified as LGBTQ skyrocketed. Well, skyrocketed is a bit of an exaggeration. You see, it has been a steady build. Let's start with gay. People who were born before 1946, 0.3% identified as gay. Then it steadily grew, baby boomers and Gen X, 1.2. Then millennials, 2.0. Now, 2.1 for gay. For lesbian, it was usually down in the 0.2%, like 0.2, 0.4, 0.7, 0.8. Now it's 1.4. Transgender, 0.3, 0.2, 0.2, 1.2, and 1.8. But the group that seemed to get the highest amount of like growth was bisexuals, which I assume also labeled with the pansexuals and other individuals who are who are attracted to multiple genders, because bisexual is sort of like a umbrella term that is used to identify all of these kinds of groups, because bisexual, implies, just biological sex. So it's like 0.3, 0.3, 1.8, 5.1, and now it's 11.5. Again, I would assume it's probably because a lot of people identify as pansexual. Then there's other, which is sort of like probably where some people were, like, some people who might identify as non-binary but not transgender. I assume asexuals would probably be in that list as well. But Glenn Greenwald, he had a lot of interesting things to say about this graph. Most particularly in regards to the B and the T parts of the LGBTQ thing. For starters, bisexuals went to 11.5, and that's a large number, making it the largest LGBTQ group in, the, place. But again, like I said, you have to factor in the fact that there are some people who probably identify as pansexual and reject the bisexual label, but had to be put in the bisexual label because, people in the media, they're still kind of hung on, like, bisexual. And to go on a little bit of a side tangent, bisexual is kind of like the black sheep of the LGBTQ rainbow at this point, because it sort of still holds on to the idea that there are two sexes. it's called bisexual for a reason. The idea was that it was formed back in a time period when people were like, it was boys or girls, pick one. Then the bis entered the scene and were like, actually no, we think that both are pretty cool. But then people who were trans entered the scene, and now people didn't really necessarily know what to believe. See, because some bisexual people accepted it because they're like, either way you shake it, if you believe transgenderism is real or not, you're not gonna get disappointed with what's under there. Especially considering there was, to a degree, a level of like crossover between like them and drag. So even if you were like a bit backwards with bisexuality, you were at the very least thinking like you were having, with a man in a dress. Basically, and like to a degree that's kind of like moved forth with how it is with the younger generation is more appealing to like things like pan, because that applies to like, they think that expands it to like more non-binary and like gender fluid and blah blah blah. Now when I say blah blah blah, I'm not saying like demeaning these identities. They're all valid 100%. But I mean, I'm just saying like there are a lot of identities that sort of like overlap with each other sometimes. The older people don't necessarily grasp it as well as the younger people do. And that is what kind of led to a point of contention with bi people and pan people. But basically, for the sake of this, they're in the same group. It's like when my poli-sci professor said like, well, we don't use labels like progressive and liberal. Well, I mean, we use the term liberal to identify like the majority of the American left. But, you would probably make people who call themselves progressives a little bit different than liberals, but for the sake of this class, we're just going to use both of the terms interchangeably. I describe it like this. It's like that math thing where it's like a square can be a rectangle, but a rectangle can't be a square. Every pan is a bi, but not every bi is a pan. Bi is like the encompassing term, and pan's more like the specific, like a general specific subset. Now, in regards to the bisexual things, it was huge. He got into a bit of a tizzy because, they divided certain things up into certain sections. When they took bi people and gay/lesbian, they pretty much were like, they asked them a couple questions about their living relationships, like their marital status. Were they married to like a person of the opposite sex? Were they married to a same-sex spouse? Were they living with the opposite-sex domestic partner? Were they living with a same-sex domestic partner? Were they single/never married? Were they separated, divorced, widowed, or nothing? Basically, here's what happened. Glenn took issue with the fact that a majority of people who are labeled bisexual, or married to opposite-sex relationships, like in hetero-looking relationships, as opposed to gay-looking relationships. Which you might say, well, what's the problem with him saying this? Well, one problem that he did was that he kept putting bi in quotation marks. Which made people like, wait, hold on, what do you mean by that? Why are you putting bi in quotation marks? Now, this sort of ties into an old, historical, thing about bi people, is that, they're being told, oh, this is just a phase, eventually you're gonna pick one. And another historical point of contention with bi people is that since a majority, to be fair, there's some historical precedent, there were a lot of gay men who would go into straight relationships and would have a straight family, they'd have kids, they'd have a wife, and they'd be basically pretending to be straight in order to, look straight, but then on the side, they'd have, gay relationships and stuff. Basically, that's what happened to many people, to pointing to bi people, basically saying, you're doing the same thing, you're just trying to be heteronormative. You're trying to adapt to our heteronormative society so you can, be, you can be oh, no, I like girls, see? Basically, that was what they were saying. These were, one of the things that they were, called were, bi-het. Bi-heterosexual. Basically saying, you're not real. You're not actually gay or any part of this community. You're actually just pretending. This is all for clout. Now, the thing is, it's funny, because it's Glenn Greenwald, he's saying, bi people, a majority will go into hetero relationships. And it's bisexual means that you guys and girls, so, naturally that's going to happen. One of these two groups is going to get a little more people than the rest. Now, it's the thing. He's like saying like, this is very interesting. Why is this the case? But he doesn't actually give an explanation of why that is. He's just like, this is very interesting. Now this is tying into the preface of his first one, where he's like, first he tries to like say like, oh, this is so cool, but why is all this increase going to the bises and the transes instead of the gays and the lesbos? Very interesting. Now that point of contention was kind of just like, like most people didn't really pay that much mind. Like, yeah, it was biphobic, but the more interesting controversy happened with what he was saying in regards to trans people. He was saying that, like, this is his literal quote for word tweet. Finally, as famed lesbian Kitty Herzog, real name Katie Herzog. Now, I mean, you could have literally called her anything else. You could have called her by her, like she has podcast. She's, I think, a journalist. But, like, what he calls her is famed lesbian. Like, that's her claim to fame. Like, oh, like, she, like, I can imagine she's like, Glenn, I have a podcast. You are a famed lesbian. And he's basically talking about, like, there are more people identifying as trans than lesbian, which he says, like, is very interesting because, as she points out, she argued that more masculine girls are now encouraged to identify as trans, causing a decrease in the lesbian population, because this is some sort of, like, big thing that, like, TERFs espouse. Like, they're saying, like, more masculine women are, like, being pushed into being trans men, which, proof? Like, again, like, this is a thing that they're just like, oh yeah, this just happens. What do you mean? I've never heard someone ever, like, I've never, ever seen a person push someone to be transgender, like, ever. Like, this thing that they're just saying, like, oh, this just happens. People are just being pushed to be transgender. Who is pushing their kid to be transgender or pushing anybody to be transgender? Nobody is pushing anybody to be transgender. Because again, if you're a parent, you want life for your kid to be easier than your life. Why would you then push them to be one of the most hated minority groups in existence? Like, I guarantee you, if you pulled up the numbers, if there were numbers about this, trans people would be the most hated members of the LGBTQ community. 100%. Why would society push these people to be trans? Why? Give me a reason. Oh, and this is the funny thing. Glenn is making such this big deal out of, like, a point something per difference. Like, oh, lesbians have 1.4%. Meanwhile, transgender people have 1.8%. Ooh, 3.4% more people identifying as trans. Oh, and I just realized this thing. What's his proof that there are more women than men in this scenario? Did they release the numbers? Because he doesn't give numbers about, like, this. This place doesn't give numbers. What if the numbers show that the people, like, a majority of these people are male to female transgender? Or what if a majority of these people are non-binary? Because non-binary could be classified as transgender to a degree. I mean, I don't know the specifics because I'm not, like, an expert on this and I'm not a member of this particular faction in the community, but, like, you don't know. They didn't give us the numbers. He didn't have the numbers of, like, male to female transgenders or female to male transgenders. Then he'd have at least, like, somewhat of a fake leg to stand on. Like, at least somewhat of a fake number that he could point to. But no, not at all. He just makes this up. And even, like, cites an article like, oh, where have all the lesbians gone? And it's like, Glenn, like, these people, they're basing their lived experiences on, like, what the overall majority of the world is. Like, these 30-year-old women are literally just like, oh, where are all the lesbians at? It's like, what do you mean, where are they at? I see them all the time. Like, I mean, Have you been on Twitter? Have you been on Tumblr? Lesbians exist everywhere. I see people draw like fan art of lesbian people every day, and I don't mean like in that way. I mean like and there are people who are like, I identify with this lesbian character because this is my representation. Like they think that the lesbians are just disappearing. No, you're just not looking for them. You don't live in their area. Glenn Greenwald is not going to be the same crowd as like a 12-year-old lesbian girl. And it's like stupid that they think like just because like their like realm of like LGBTQ acceptance is a bit different than like how the broader world is. Like the only thing societal I see about that graph is that society is now more accepting of LGBTQ people, and that people are now not being shunned into not being LGBTQ. Which I assumed, as a gay man, Glenn Greenwald would be supportive of, but because the numbers are going up on the wrong kinds of gays, then that means it's a bad idea. It's a bad thing. Now, I was originally going to leave it at that, but then I found out that Glenn Greenwald actually made a response video to this, and being the person that I am, I had to watch it to at the very least see, like, can Glenn defend himself? And, well, he did not. I mean, I came in open-minded. I was thinking, like, I mean, what is it? Will Glenn give us a reason? And no, he didn't. Basically, he was saying, like, the whole beginning of the video was basically him saying, like, well, I mean, people shunning me for my controversial opinions and my controversial reporting. This is nothing new. I've experienced this before. I mean, I'm the one who reported the Snowden thing, remember? It's like, well, this is stupid. Glenn, this is not comparable. You're comparing a bunch of people online who are calling you transphobic to the U.S. government? Are you serious? Nah, I didn't care that much about that part. Like, for the most part, his video is just like, it's dumb response. But I think this part perfectly exemplifies that Glenn is not only doing this out of, like, willful ignorance, he's doing this out of, like, basic lying.
A huge explosion in the number of people who identify as bisexual, and a huge explosion, even bigger, in the number of people who identify as transgender. The lesbian and gay increases are very small, pretty much what you would expect given increased societal acceptance. So 0.7% of Gen Xers identify as lesbian, 1.4% of Gen Zs identify as lesbian. It's basically doubled from 0.7 to 1.4, a pretty mild increase. Gay is even a little bit less. 1.2% of Gen Xers identify as being gay men. 2.1% of Gen Z, so slightly less than half. That's the increase in lesbian and gay. Obviously, that doesn't account for a fourfold increase. What really has exploded are the percentages of people identifying as bisexual. So from Gen X, we have 1.8% of people identifying as bisexual, and in Gen Z, 11.5%. It is an increase of 7 times the number. 7 times the number in that short time. The trans increase is even starker. Only 0.2% of Gen Xers identified as trans. 1.8% of Gen Z people identify as trans. That is an increase of a ninefold increase in the number of people.
I'll give you a moment to think about what's wrong with that statement. Many things. For starters, he's saying that there is a bigger group of people who identify as trans people than bi people. Like, it's like, oh, bi people, they increased a little bit. They increased from 1.8 to 11.5, but there was this bigger, massive number of like 0.2 to 1.8%. That's a huge number. Like, I mean, literally, he begins the clip by saying, like, there's a big increase in bi people, but there's this huge increase, even more so, in the number of transes. And, like, I was thinking about this while I was watching it. I was only paying, like, half attention, and I was, like, thinking, like, yeah, what? That's weird. That's not the numbers I remember. I remember there was a 1.2 raised to trans people. That's weird. What? Then it turns out I realized what was the big problem. He's using the number from Gen X and then skipping all the way to Gen Z. He literally is skipping over millennials just so he can make the numbers seem like they're bigger expansions than they are. Like, yes, a increase from 0.2 to 1.8 seems bigger than an increase from 1.2 to 1.8. He's specifically using those numbers. He's literally taking the information and then removing parts of the information that would 100% disprove his claim, because his claim is that there's this huge, massive influx of people identifying as trans, but the numbers don't add up. 1.2 to 1.8 is not a big number. It's not an increase. Literally, you could just, that is a literally 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Not that big, but that's not the number he wants you to know. He wants you to think it went from 0.2 to 1.8, because that makes the threat seem scarier. It's scarier to think that the transes are growing bigger at a big exponential rate, rather than them growing at a very marginal rate. Like, literally, that's tiny. Bi people are literally went from 5.1 to 11.5. That's a way huge leap than 1.2 to 1.8. But he doesn't care about that massive, he does care a little bit. He mentioned it, like this big influx of like bi people, but he's really cares for some reason. Like he talks about the bi number first. Like, when you're talking about things in videos or anything, you don't talk about the thing you want to talk about most important first. You save the most important thing for last. Why do you think I move my topics of my videos to the end? You're talking about that at the end because you want people to like ease into the big news. He's really hyper-focusing on this 1.8 number and is literally skewing the information so that you think it's a bigger increase, because trans people are the boogeymen of the right now, and that's how you can form the alliance with them. Now, I mean, again, it also stems from a place of jealousy. It's fine when the LGBTQ numbers grow, but not when it's the numbers I don't want to grow. He wants the gay number to be the 11.5. He doesn't want the number to ever even touch something that is not the gay number. Like, this is the thing. Like, I was gonna literally end this video without even mentioning this because I forgot about this because I was like, got so heated. But this whole thing of like the lesbians being replaced with the transes, this is the white genocide theory, but for gays. I'm being serious. He thinks that the gays and the lesbians, they're being replaced by the bis and the transes with their large numbers. That is basically what he is saying. I'm being serious. Especially because the numbers don't add up. Like I said, I've seen lesbians all the time. But he wants there to be this big, bad boogeyman to like ruin, to that's the big boogeyman of the right wing, and that's how he needs to appeal to the right wing. To be part of their boogeyman. And there's even parts of the video where he talks about I don't agree with 100% of the transgender ideology. It's like, what ideology? It's not an ideology. It's a sexual orientation and gender identity. That's what it is. It's not an ideology, because that's the boogeyman. It's the gay agenda, the transgender ideology. That's the scary boogeyman. Like, 10 years ago, this was 100% what would be said about Glenn Greenwald, because he's gay. And the fact that he, for some reason, is not seeing this parallel struggle is infuriating, and it shows how easy it is. You can just be forgetting about, people who go through your same struggles. Like me, it's the same thing with, people who were part of the civil rights movement, and then how they moved on to, the gay rights movement. They saw that there was the same struggle. People who were born into being something they cannot control, being discriminated for that reason. And they needed to fight against it, which is a good thing. But for some reason, Glenn sees a problem with that. And that is why a lot of people have taxi turned on him. Not as much as David Miranda turned on him when he was, out of the beach, but you know what I'm saying. Am I right, guys? So yeah, that's basically all I have to say about Glenn Greenwald. He did a lot of good work, but that doesn't detract from the fact that he's kind of cringe ideologically. Thanks for watching this video. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and click that bell to be notified when a future video mine comes out. And if you're interested in more content from me, You can go to my website, follow me on Twitter, join my Discord, or check out my articles on the Independent Political Report.